So I'm going to look at 3 case studies. I'll begin by saying the art spaces I call out in these 3 locations are, for the purpose of time, there's no way to give you a comprehensive list. So please do not mistake it as Miranda's highlights and favorites. It's just really an opportunity to just give you a taste of what I've seen and experienced in these contexts. And, you know, I'll just begin by sort of painting a scene for you of a place that really is one of my favorite spots in New Orleans. And here you're looking at an image of the Music Box Village, which is run by New Orleans Airlift, an organization founded in 2007. And this is what you might find during, it could be any night of the year, but typically during the spring, summer, fall months, where you have this fantastical village structure where every building that you see is actually also a playable instrument in addition to something you can move through architecturally. And they've hosted the most incredibly diverse selection of musicians performing there. Everyone from Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth to DJ Manny Fresh to rap stars associated with Cash Money Records to local New Orleans favorites like the Dixie Cups, and really a utopic environment where you have this sort of, gorgeous, well-established oak trees, the music box amidst it, and a very carefully curated environment created by artists. I think it's no exaggeration to say most people who come here feel utterly enchanted by what it is. So I just wanted to say, sort of set the scene in terms of what do I mean when I say an artist space? And I think it's actually wonderfully poetic to be giving this talk in the lab, which is a space dedicated to experimentation. So I don't think there's any one way to define an artist space, but I think of it chiefly as a space that was often founded by artists whose chief governing structure is still led by artists or guided by an artist-driven mission. I feel like I don't want to drill down further than that because, as I'll talk about, the nature of these spaces is so diverse. It's almost not helpful to get more specific than that. But these are the spaces that do inspire me as a museum curator, and I think it's a really interesting open question what role museums can have vis-a-vis these types of spaces or in dialogue with these spaces. So the first case study I'll look at is New Orleans, where I was a practicing curator for 7.5 years. I was hired in I started in end of 2007 to be New Orleans Museum of Art's first exclusively dedicated curator to modern and contemporary art. And I say that to say that this museum had presented contemporary art exhibitions before, but they'd never had a dedicated curator. And they asked me to start this department actually pretty much as a direct response to the recovery efforts following the levee failures and Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And if you live in New Orleans, it's very painful for people to just hear the shorthand Hurricane Katrina. It's actually more common to hear the phrase levee failures, because just to remind everyone, it was the levee failures that caused a widespread flooding in the city, and Hurricane Katrina actually missed a direct hit of the city in 2005. So I'm showing you this map just to sort of begin the discussion in terms of what happened on August 28th, 2005. Essentially, 80% of the city went underwater. This flooding map gives you a sense of really only the depth of the water. So where you're seeing in deep blue, the water was 8 to 15 feet deep, going, and down from there. This is where the water measurements were taken on September 5th, so about a week after the hurricane hit. So it gives you a sense not only of the breadth of the flooding, but how long the water remained in the city. We know of at least 1,800 deaths directly affiliated with the immediate effects of the hurricane, the immediate effects of the flooding, but so many more occurred from trauma, loss of housing, loss, essentially the after effects of affiliated with this catastrophe. And so it's just a bit of a grounding to understand, like, so what happened afterwards? Well, a few things, or I should say a lot of things. The city, it was an open question when I arrived in 2007, would New Orleans recover? I think it's a bit too complicated to say yes or no. Some parts did recover, some parts did not. But something that could not have necessarily been predicted before the levee failures was the proliferation of art spaces in on what's now known as essentially the St. Claude Arts District. I believe it got an official city designation about 3 or 4 years ago. Part of this had to do, well, there were so many contributing factors. Part of this had to do with the loss of housing, loss of studios, artists wanting to create spaces anew and start fresh, literally rip out buildings down to their studs and build spaces for their art. Another really important factor to bring into the discussion also is the phenomenon of large-scale art events, and I'll talk about that in conjunction with Athens as well. So there was, as part of the response, the recovery response to Hurricane Katrina, there was also a biennial established in New Orleans. You've probably heard of it, Prospect, whose first iteration launched in 2008. And now they're going to open their 5th iteration in November. And November of 2020. And so there was definitely an urgency felt amongst artists who had been practicing in New Orleans. I need an art space to show my art when the biennial was coming. It's too simple to say these spaces popped up only in response to the biennial. A lot of these trends were a long time coming, but that was definitely a contributing factor. And I'm just showing you a map that kind of gives you a sense of, how they proliferated along St. Claude. And what I found really fascinating about these spaces was that they were often founded by groups of artists essentially committing together as groups to the labor of preparing the space and then sharing the rent and then manning the space. One that I'll mention that was one of the first to sort of get going in 2007 was Good Children Gallery. And I'm showing you an interior of an exhibition by the artist Stephen Collier. And also a second line parade, because that's New Orleans. And I think you have to understand that, yes, there's a context of galleries and art spaces as we might traditionally think of them, but there's also an extremely layered and dense tradition of live music performance, parades, Mardi Gras culture, and these parades are not confined to the one day of Mardi Gras. You could have a second line parade literally any day of the year in New Orleans, and some of them are affiliated with established social aid and pleasure clubs. Some of them are neighborhood organizations, but I like this photo because it shows you sort of how it could be a random Tuesday, and you could see a second line going down St. Claude. I actually happen to recognize a number of people in this photo, some of them artists that do exhibit at Good Children Gallery. I've spoken a lot in depth with the founders of this space. A number of them were professors and students at University of New Orleans. And, they talk a lot about how the birth of this space began with friendship, essentially the ability to trust a circle of like-minded artists. And that trust really is important if you're going to share a lease with someone. And if you're going to commit, for example, to a schedule of having regular open hours, being available on Saturdays to make the space available to the public, to do the labor of turning over the shows. If any of you are already affiliated with art spaces, you know all about this daily need of labor to keep the spaces going. Good Children was one of many spaces that opened up specifically in time for the launch of the biennial. And then during the biennial, it was a fascinating open question, like, what happens after the biennial? And I'm really pleased to say that the spaces that I'm going to describe to you are all still open. And I was so happy to see that it wasn't a phenomenon intrinsically tethered to, say, a larger art world phenomenon, but really community-driven to the extent that it was able now to sustain itself 12 years. So another space I'll mention is the front, right across the street from Good Children, so they literally face each other. I'm showing you the floor plan because it has a really interesting structure where, yes, the financial obligations of the space are shared amongst dues-paying members, but also the rotation of the galleries is done in an interesting way where there's 4 exhibition spaces, or maybe 4 quadrants of the space, and an artist has the choice of either having 4 slots of of each of a different quadrant, or getting the whole space at once. So in other words, you could take over the whole space, or you could say, in March I want room 1, and in June I want room 2, and in, and so on. And again, I thought it provided another fascinating collaborative model. Similarly founded by some artists that were affiliated with the University of New Orleans, and I think that does highlight the importance of arts education and educational institutions as supporting structures, often for artist communities. Another support to this endeavor was Paul Chan, the artist Paul Chan, who came to New Orleans in 2007 and did a project with Creative Time known as Waiting for Godot in the lower 9th Ward. And he, as part of preparing this large-scale public project, essentially a performance of the play of Waiting for Godot in lower 9th, volunteered to teach a class at University of New Orleans free of charge, knowing that this university was essentially literally flooded and financially devastated at the time. And many of his students that sort of banded around his practice and helped with the launching of Waiting for Godot, then went on to be some of the founding leaders of the front. So I say that also to say sometimes it's a combination of inside and outside forces that get these spaces going. Next, I'm taking you back to the Music Box Village. I showed you a image of how it looks like now at the beginning of my talk, but I'm actually very fond of these images of how it looked when it first launched, similarly in 2007. So just to provide a bit of context, Delaney Martin and Rusty Laser and Taylor Shepard conceived of New Orleans Airlift initially as an organization dedicated to the idea of artists' exchange. So in other words, when they say airlift, helping artists leave the city of New Orleans, find opportunities elsewhere, and bringing artists to New Orleans to experience the city. And because of their strong interest in performance and music, they came up with this idea in collaboration with the street artist Swoon, or Callie Curry, of creating a performance venue that was also a playable musical instrument. The very first iteration of this concept was actually turning an old Creole cottage from the 18th century into a playable house. And I remember at the time I was, again, curator at NOMA, being invited by these artists to tour the Creole cottage. And I remember going to the space. It was a rambling old house, very creaky. We walked through it. And they talked about, well, can we partner with the museum on making this into an art space? And I remember at the time thinking, I love that idea, but also, are you sure you want to partner with a museum? Then you're going to have to put in ADA ramps, and it might change the tenor of what you're trying to do. And so, we continued the discussion, and we went out to the backyard, and they had a beautiful table set up with tea and biscuits, and we continued to talk in the backyard behind the house. And I did at the time say, well, it's an 18th century Creole cottage, you'd have to do some renovations, what it was safety concerns, blah, blah. And they said, no, it's perfectly safe. And at the time, they had some young folks volunteering to help renovate the cottage. And this is probably the most cinematic moment of my life that I'm about to describe to you. But essentially, there were some folks pulling some boards away as part of, just getting into the renovation process. We saw someone pull a board away from the house, and we heard a loud snap. And this is no exaggeration, the house collapsed in front of us, like in front of our eyes, in an enormous cloud of like, just like a mushroom cloud of dust. Like the entire house caved in. And it is a miracle that no one was hurt. I mean, there was no one in the house at that moment, but I got to see a house cave in front of my face, and and that just doesn't happen. Yeah, I mean, that's the only time that's happened to me, but I couldn't, yeah, it was just, and I was literally holding a teacup, like watching it happen, and so it was, there was this, I mean, again, my life is not always this cinematic, but we were just like, okay, we're gonna pause, we're gonna take a breath on this, and I was like, okay, yeah, definitely, and so the structures that you're seeing in what became the Music Box Village were literally built from the boards of this Creole cottage. So essentially the house caved in, and then they built these separate, they called it a shantytown structure, where each shanty had an instrument embedded within it, really made from these recycled boards. And what you're seeing, the gentleman in the black coat is Quintron, the musician Quintron, and he acted as conductor for when they would do musical performances of the shantytown. So in other words, different musicians and artists would go inside the different shanty structures, and Quintron would conduct them as you would an orchestra. And that was part of the concept of the piece. It was always an open question, would these structures survive hurricane season? And again, I'm really impressed to say that the structure that I showed you back here, which is now on a different site, has been rebuilt, recalibrated, re-engineered specifically so that it can be permanent and it doesn't have to be, for example, deconstructed every time you approach June, which is the start of hurricane season. So, so that's the Music Box Village. I'm showing you NOMA just to give you a sense. This is where I worked at the time, and you know, in launching the contemporary program, I was never given the mandate, you should show local artists, you should showcase what happens here. They actually said, it can be national, it can be international, it's what you want. But I felt like there was such interesting and compelling artistic activity that wasn't being given, say, an institutional voice. And I say this without sort of trying to command a hierarchy over the role of institutional validation. At the same time, it was it seemed like there was a role to play for this institution in helping provide support to artists who were working in the St. Claude district and giving them funding and leverage to sort of expand upon their practice. So this is an example of a project we did with Swoon, with Callie Curry, who, as I mentioned, was one of the founders of the concept of the Music Village. We asked her to create a commission for the Grand Hall, which is the entrance lobby into the New Orleans Museum of Art. The only restriction that she had was that nothing could touch the floor because we like to rent the space for weddings. So I think she came up with an incredible solution. People did get married underneath this beautiful goddess. So she created this piece as a commission. And we wanted it, we deliberately structured the way this was presented to also provide a platform for New Orleans Airlift to showcase their practice. So they were a very present element in our public programming. The piece belonged to Callie Curry following the commission, so it lived for a while in Braddock, Pennsylvania, in an art space that she worked on there, and was recently, well, like a few years ago, acquired by the Detroit Institute of Art. So that was the last place I saw it. But the funding she had to create the lino cut that created essentially the Lhasa, the sea goddess sort of acknowledging New Orleans' ties to the sea and the seafood industry. She's reused on quite a number of occasions, everywhere from Haiti to Sao Paulo, Brazil. Iterations of this print have reappeared. So I just, just to close the chapter on that case study of New Orleans, it was an incredible moment. I feel very I still feel very impressed and tethered to the artistic activity that flourished at that time, without in any way wanting to romanticize the realities of what it was like for these artists to work with a dearth of resources. And I in no way want to imply that that's the ideal situation for artists. It's clearly not. But just to shift gears, I'll talk next about Appalachia, Kentucky, and specifically about Appalshop. And some of you may be familiar with Appalshop. They won an award a few years ago from Yerba Buena Arts Center, and also did a presentation at the YBCA. They are a nonprofit based in Whitesburg, Kentucky, that was founded in 1969, essentially designed to be a hub of artistic activity right in the heart of Appalachia, dedicated to supporting everything from a radio station to film production to the documentation of folk music practices, the documentation of craft practices, a community gathering space, really all kinds of different forms of creativity in the region. And I show you this image actually of the landscape because it was such a, I visited Whitesburg for the first time 2 years ago, knowing that it was the heart of coal country. And I show you in a way how lush the landscape is. I knew that that this community had experienced a lot of this struggle when faced with the environmental effects of the coal industry. So I did not expect to go to a region that looks predominantly green. It took some understanding to an education on my part to understand that there is mountaintop removal, but in most situations, the way the coal extraction process works, the mountain is hollowed out. So in other words, to someone driving through the landscape, the mountain might still look intact. You kind of have to get down into what's really happening to realize the effects of the coal industry, which extend from everything to the company towns that were built to support the coal industry, to the qualities of water, the way the extraction of coal works for many of these places. The chemicals that are needed to extract coal from the raw ore extracted from the mountain, they essentially put that sludge at the top, and they dig a reservoir at the top of the mountain and dump all the sludge into it. So of course, when it rains, all the sludge runs down the mountain and gets into the water supply. So it's a very complex and pervasive problem in the region. The reason Appalshop was founded was in response in some ways to a moment of crisis in the community. Here I show you a still from the filming process of Stranger with a Camera. Has anyone seen Stranger with a Camera? If not, I really recommend it. It's a little over an hour, and it's an incredible film that I feel like is crucial viewing on what it means to do work as an artist within a community. So the woman you're seeing sort of seated in the corner there is Elizabeth Barrett. She was the director of this documentary. And the purpose of this documentary was to document a specific event that occurred in 1967 in Jeremiah, Kentucky, so not far from Whitesburg, where a filmmaker known as, I always need to remind myself the name of it, Hugo Connor, was a French filmmaker who was commissioned to create a portrait of life in the United States through different chapters. And one chapter that he wanted to capture was the life of coal miners in Kentucky. Hugo Connor brought a film crew down to Appalachia. He waited for the scene that he thought would be a compelling chapter to his film, and he essentially saw a coal miner returning from the mine, walking to his home and greeting his children, and he's covered in coal dust. And so he saw the miner coming home, asked the miner for permission to film him. The coal miner agreed, and so they started filming these shots of him coming home, essentially sitting on his porch, bouncing his toddler on his knee. And the conflict occurred essentially when the landlord of the property, and his name was I'm sorry, I always have to remind myself the name of it. Hobart Eisen saw the film crew. This is so essentially the coal miner was a tenant on land owned by Hobart Eisen. Hobart Eisen had not been approached for permission to film, and he essentially called out to the filmmakers to stop what they were doing. He fired a couple warning shots into the air, and then he fired a shot directly at the filmmaker and killed him, like in broad daylight, while the two other cameramen fled. So this was an event of tremendous controversy in the community, but believe it or not, something that Elizabeth Barrett explores in her documentary, which follows the events of this murder, was how locally in Jeremiah and in Whitesburg, Hobart Eisen was regarded as a hero. The general sentiment in the community was that these filmmakers had no business being there. They were not asked to be there, and they had no right to try to come in and depict this community as poor. And I should say, you have to watch the film. She's not an apologist for what happened. This is not, letting anyone off the hook for what was clearly murder in broad daylight. But she does sort of track the way that people baked pies for Hobart Eisen. In the end, he was convicted of manslaughter, but he served less than a year in prison, and died with a role of prominence within the community. So Elizabeth Barrett grew up in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and was part of a coterie of filmmakers affiliated with Appalshop that essentially, by responding to this moment of crisis, creating an environment that allowed the community itself to create its own form of artistic expression. So in other words, if the community was not responsive to outsiders coming in, what are the tools that can be provided locally so that people can create films from their perspective, or a radio show from their perspective, or a theatrical performance from their perspective? And so Appalshop was founded. The murder happened in 1969. The murder happened in 1967. Appalshop was founded in 1969. In many ways, as a response to the crisis surrounding this event. They continue to produce a prolific amount of work. A big part of what they do is try to provide thoughtful education into what life is actually like in this region. I think it's fair to say there are a lot of stereotypes surrounding this region, and many of them not positive, and even from people who would claim themselves to be progressive. And so I'm not trying to throw stones, but the idea of the Kentucky coal miner conjures a lot for a lot of people. And so part of Appalshop's role is to try to guide photojournalists who regularly come to this region of the country to sort of get the quintessential example of a Trump voter, or the conservative America, that literally photojournalists and journalists showing up being, find me a very conservative coal miner that I can talk to as an example of right-wing America. And Appalshop really does a lot of incredible work in trying to add nuance to the narrative, and at the very least help people understand not just the situation within coal mining, but also the artistic production that has been produced there for generations. Everything from quilt making production to furniture making production to musical traditions, etc. And I'm just showing you, for example, a place they took me, which is a memorial to deceased coal miners. And the phrase that you're seeing says, "Bent back, sore knee mines." Something I didn't realize was that many of the entrances to coal mines are less than 3 feet tall. I don't know, I had this picture in my mind of people walking into a coal mine, standing up with picks and axes. Most mines are not like that at all. They're actually very short entrances, and essentially you ride in carts that are just tall enough for a grown man to sit in a cart and roll in, sometimes an hour into to the mine, and so you literally can't stand up. And one of the big reasons that There's fewer jobs for coal miners, and I'm sure you know this already, mechanization, essentially creating the proliferation of technology, which allows the mechanical extraction out of these types of mines as opposed to manual operators. So this is actually the daughter of Elizabeth Barrett, Ada Barrett, sort of driving me through abandoned coal tipples. You know, after coal companies go bankrupt, they essentially leave the structures in place with no obligation to clean them up, and also to show you an example of that craft work that I mentioned earlier of. You know, for example, here you're seeing a piece of carved furniture made in commemoration of the filming of a film created at Appalshop. And, you know, and to get sort of into that question that I talked about earlier of like, so what's the role of a museum vis-a-vis this type of organization? That's still an open question that we're figuring out. They've produced so many incredible films, and the Speed Art Museum has shown quite a number of those films as part of our cinema program. We also recognize that there's not a book that documents the entire multi-decade history of Appalshop. So it could be an institutional responsibility to help them in the creation of a publication. And you know, there's always that tricky question of how does a very community-grounded practice translate, for lack of a better expression, to the cold white walls of a museum gallery. And I had a fascinating conversation with the leaders of Appalshop, where we sat on a couch, and they said, this is the couch where most filmmakers come, and they sit, and we talk for hours, we talk about what's going on in the community. So would you consider showing the couch? Because this is actually where the action happens. This is actually where, you know, the rubber meets the road. And I didn't say yes or no. I really have to think about, like, what does it mean to show the couch, not as an aesthetic object, but as an active object in the creative process. So, yeah, we could talk about whether to show the couch. Yeah, that's sort of wrapping up the chapter on Appalshop. And then the last chapter I want to mention comes from my most recent experience, which is being a curatorial resident in Athens, Greece, under the auspices of ARC Athens, which is a artist and curator residency that was founded last year. It's one of several residencies, 4 of which I know of in Athens, that have cropped up in the last 24 months. And that, I think, provokes another really interesting wave of questions as far as the after effects of Documenta in Athens. So what I'm showing you here is sunset from one of the hills in Athens. And just a very typical example of the way street art covers almost every inch of this incredible metropolis. It's hard to summarize all the impressions Athens made on me. I would say, of course, the juxtaposition of the ancient and contemporary. Literally from almost any point in the city, you can see the Acropolis and be reminded of that legacy of early democracy, but also Athens is an incredible hotbed of artistic activity right now in the wake of the global financial crisis and in the wake of Documenta. And you know, there's a lot to be said about how those two factors collide. One phenomenon that happened while I was there this past fall was Olchi Day, which means no day, in Athens on October 28th. And I wanted to mention this as a fascinating example to me of a country trying to grapple with its own sense of nationalism. And this is a question that I think is familiar in the US, like how do we as Americans address elements of our own nationalism, knowing that nationalism has a historic tie to white supremacy. So how do we address the topic of nationalism within our own historical context, knowing that it has these affiliations? There's a similar conundrum in Greece. So that the nature of No Day celebrates Greece's refusal to surrender to German occupation during World War II. And this past October, there were these young art students, and I should say a part of Orchidée are military parades all over the city. And this group of art students staged what they called silly walks as part of the Orchidée parades, where they were deliberately sort of invading a parade and walking in a very silly Monty Python-esque exaggerated fashion. And sort of adding elements of almost Dada performance to this event. It infuriated a lot of people. There were all kinds of articles in the news. But the point of this artistic response was actually to call out the negative effects of nationalism and warfare, and to call out, actually, this one news piece shows a historical example of a wounded soldier struggling to walk. And one of the points of the silly walk was actually to recognize the injury to the bodies of people who participate in war. So just acknowledging that also in Greece there's this similar pushback or questioning of nationalist dialogue that's definitely running through the discourse there. So I'll just mention a few artist spaces that I found just really interesting and impressive. The first I have to say is where I was staying. So I stayed at a place called Atopos, which hosted my residency. Atopos in Greek means a place of strangeness or a place outside. A recent art installation they had last year was by this artist. Her name is Antigone Tiskarkaropoulou. And what you're seeing is the Fluffy Library, where it's an installation of an enormous imaginary fluffy animal whose crevices are full of books which challenge binary gender conceptions. So it was meant to be a playful space, a place of rest, a place of welcome, and a place actually where children could explore, for example, children's books, sort of breaking down traditional notions of gender binaries. So when I stayed there with the artist Tamashi Jackson, we were residents at the same time, they actually had to pull out poor Fluffy, who left the art space so that we could have beds and Tamashi could have a studio, but they left all the pink walls. So I actually really enjoyed my Pepto-Bismol pink environment where I lived for a couple months. Another space I'll mention is Victoria Square Projects. This is a project that was founded by Rick Lowe who was a commissioned artist for the artistic exhibition Documenta. And just to refresh everyone, Documenta is a German art exhibition that happens once every 5 years. It's the largest, well, I should say that has the largest funding of any contemporary art exhibition in the world. It's traditionally hosted in Kassel, Germany, but as you may know, the last iteration was a double venue where every exhibiting artist also presented work in Athens, Greece. The previous iteration also had an outpost in Kabul, Afghanistan. And this was a deliberate choice on the behalf of the artistic director, Adam Simsik, to sort of open a dialogue of essentially the role of the European Union, the Greek bailout, Germany's relationship to Greece vis-a-vis the economic bailout. And a lot of the work pivoted around artists coming to Athens and essentially exploring what social sculpture, and that's a phrase Rick Lowe has within this environment. So Rick Lowe, you may know him from his work in Project Row Houses in Houston. He won a MacArthur Award for this. He partnered with a Greek artist, Maria Papadimitriou, to found Victoria Square. I'm showing you an image of Victoria Square in Kypseli neighborhood. And one of the reasons that Kypseli neighborhood was selected as the basis for this artist project was because Kypseli was home to quite a number of immigrants and refugees flowing into Greece. The refugee crisis, it should be said, is continuing. I believe this year, I looked up the statistics, 16,000 migrants have arrived thus far to the island of Lesbos just in this year. which is the highest number since 2016 when the refugee crisis was at its height. So in 2016, when the early planning stages for Victoria Square project were going on, the square itself was literally full of refugees, people who were stopping in Greece on their way of trying to continue on through the European continent. And unfortunately, one of the responses to the refugee crisis, as you may know, has been the rise of fascism, not just in Greece, but throughout Europe. And I'm showing you an image of Golden Dawn parades. Golden Dawn had a political party office in Kypseli, not very far from Victoria Square. They had seats in Parliament, and Golden Dawn is an openly fascist party. They self-describe themselves as neo-fascist. Their emblem, you probably recognize, is deliberately evocative of a swastika. But this sort of helps contextualize that resistance to the strains of nationalism that you might have seen with those art students with the silly walk that I showed you earlier. So sort of Rick Lowe and Maria Papadimitriou looking at Victoria Project as a case study. The space opened in 2017 as part of Documenta, and became a space for quite a number of different activities. Community art space, a place of gathering, a place where artists could be commissioned to do public artworks. And then it really, similar to what I described in New Orleans, became an open question, would the space continue past Documenta? And as sad as I was to miss Documenta while it was on in Athens, I was actually, part of me was really fascinated to see Athens 2 years out from Documenta, to see what are the more long-term lasting effects of this type of large-scale phenomenon coming to a city. So what you're seeing in one of the images is Tomasz and I meeting with the current director of the space, Niovi Zarampuka, who is working with her coworkers at Victoria Square Projects. It's still going, mostly through grant funding, but also in a place of transition. So now that the mission of Documenta specifically is over, what is the evolving role of this space? And I have to say I'm impressed by their willingness to be nimble and responsive to what the evolving role of this space is. And what does it mean to continue to invite artists, for example, to Kypseli and to create art in Kypseli? And they're very transparent about the fact that it's an active day-to-day thing that has to be felt out, what the role of this art space is in this context. I'll also, what I'm showing you now is an image from Snetha residency, which was founded in 2012. Snetha is Athens backwards, just in case you were wondering. Similarly based in the Kypseli neighborhood, and this was another artist-founded endeavor. The creative director is Augustus Vainogoulou, who is an practicing artist himself, but I would say similar to the mission of New Orleans Airlift, Snetha residency is dedicated to cultural exchange between artists inside and outside the city. So in other words, the space provides, is a nonprofit that provides a 2-month residency specifically to artists not from Athens and often from further abroad to come to create work, to respond to the city of Athens. And Snetha also employs curators both inside and outside of Athens to create shows in response to these artists' work and also to draw in local artists' work as well. So again, it's sort of these artists taking this very active role in the role of artistic exchange for a city. And then the last space I'll mention is 3137 Project Space, which was founded by 3 Greek artists, Chrysanthi Koumenaki, Cosmas Nikolaou, and Paki Vasopoulou. And this, again, was a space founded by 3 artists, this time in the neighborhood of Exarchia, which is very close to Kypseli, both as a space to show their work, but also to give space to other artists who are interested in community engagement. So the image that you're seeing here is actually when Jonathan de Andrade came and gave a talk in affiliation with Documenta, so it was a presenting venue during Documenta, but now it serves as a continuing space for artists wanting to do work embedded in a community. And Exarchia, like Kypseli, has in the past few years been a home not just for artists and anarchists and creative thinkers, but also for refugees. And I remember, this will be embedded in my memory forever, the experience of walking to this space in Exarchia, and it was on a quiet Sunday morning, and I remember, walking through the neighborhood and seeing a cluster of police on the corner, just kind of standing there. And I remember thinking, that's interesting, and then like walking a few more blocks and seeing another cluster of police just standing there, and then so on, my whole walk through Exarchia, and asking the artist Chrysanthi about it, and she's, and this is essentially part of a very concerted government crackdown on trying to flush refugees out of the squatter homes in Exarchia and trying to push everyone to deportation and containment camps outside of the city. So in other words, establishing police presence so that people feel discouraged from trying to set up homes in Exarchia. And even while I was there, during the first few weeks I was there, they conducted a raid of what was formerly an apartment building and pulled out dozens of women and children who were essentially just trying to establish, temporary lives in this neighborhood, and pulling them all and sending them to the detention camps outside the city. And there's a lot more I can say about the camps, but I'll keep it focused on the artists here. And essentially wanting to show you these, to me, as relevant examples of artists, again, taking the lead in responding to specific situations. Ultimately, I consider myself an artist advocate, which is why I think it's relevant for me to share knowledge about these, but I also think it's, like I said, as a curator, I'm always cognizant of the open question of, like, what is my role as a museum curator in supporting these types of spaces? So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions, and I really thank you for your time. Okay, any thoughts or questions? Sorry, it's a little hard to, yes,
So you came back to this question, or you ended with this question, but what do you think the museum's obligation, if they have it, and how common do you think your own perspective on it is in the museum community?
Yeah, so the first question is, do they have one? Do they have an obligation? Most museums, it's not necessarily in the mission statement, but I think it sort of pivots on the leadership and what they want to support and add and emphasize. I do my best to emphasize, or to say that there are certain types of projects that these art spaces have the nimbleness to achieve that would be harder to do in a museum context without romanticizing the fact that it's a much deeper struggle for resources. So the short answer is, I think there is a role to play in helping provide a platform and sharing of resources between museums and art spaces. I think that is one way we can offer support. How that happens and in what context has to be felt out really case by case. As I mentioned, I showed you just this tiniest cross-section of the art spaces in New Orleans, and it was, I would say, an open source of questioning, like, why this art space and not another art space? Why are you supporting them and not that? And to me, I've really had to address it on a case by case, also acknowledging the museum is not always the home for every type of project. Like, and this was something I came up with against with Appalshop. I do think there's a role, for example, in providing publication and documentation and showcasing their efforts, but there is a limit to what you can show in a gallery space of what is ultimately a community-based dialogue, and that's the core of it, through and through. So I could show you recordings, I could show you video documentation, I can show you archival material. There are any number of ephemera I could show you as far as acknowledging what they do. In the end, I can't recreate what happens on the couch, is what I was trying to say. So yeah, it's something I still wrestle with. Oh, and how common is it? It depends. Yeah, I know colleagues who are very interested in this type of dialogue, some less so. It's actually mostly driven by the mission of their organization. Yeah. Sorry, next. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, it's really case by case. Some of these organizations, like the ones I showed you in New Orleans, have received funding from artist-endowed foundations that you know well, like the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. And as someone, I'm on the board of the Joan Mitchell Foundation, and something I didn't even realize till I got involved is that not only are artist-endowed foundations currently one of the greatest providers of support to artist-run spaces, they're actually on a trajectory to remain and be even more so one of the greatest sources of funding support. We have coming down the pike the Cy Twombly Foundation. The scope of their endowment is going to be larger than the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, and Pollock Krasner combined. So we're in this fascinating moment where the market prices that are driving mid-century painting are going to be manifested in artist-endowed foundations that have played a really prominent, beautiful role in essentially artists supporting artists from beyond their lifetime in continuing these endeavors. In Greece, there are organizations like the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and the Onassis Foundation that are providing support. But I think with any of the places I mentioned, it's not one thing, and like I mentioned, sometimes Paul Chan would provide an artwork for the front to auction for support. Or, New Orleans Airlift, they now have support from the Lambent Foundation, from Blade of Grass. They also generate revenue now from ticket sales to their venues. So you essentially, to see this performance, you have to buy a ticket. And now that they're a permanent space, they have that recurring source of revenue. The front, like I showed you, is supported by member dues. So it's kind of again, case by case, often a patchwork. Appalshop, if you go on their webpage, they list a lot of their prominent funders. They do. It should be said, one of their greatest sources of funding used to be the National Endowment for the Arts. And that is no longer the case. And so that absence of funding has created an open question regarding how it's going to continue in the future. But that's how it essentially did get started through an NEA grant. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other question? Yeah.
So Miranda, I'm interested in how these experiences have informed your current role at the Museum, particularly the part.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe what your thoughts are on some upcoming exhibitions at the Street.
Yeah, so it's really hard to go to Greece and not become fascinated with democracy and how we think about democracy. It was a real education for me as far as the nature and structure of early democracy. There was so much I didn't know as a contemporary curator that had never taken an antiquities class. Above all, to me, the brevity of the democracy in ancient Greece. I had no idea that it lasted at best less than 200 years and not even a continuous 200 years. And then it vanished off the face of the planet until the Enlightenment in the 18th century. So I guess again, being American, and this was again waking up to my own American ignorance, you kind of think of a democracy as this default endeavor that, of course, everyone should be a democracy, and I do believe I do believe in the role of democracy, but I was completely ignorant to how fleeting a role it has played in the broader scope of history. And I will say it's really been fascinating to me when you examine the role of early democracy, the mythologies that American history has constructed around how our democracy was formed. In other words, what were clear departures on our part from the founding fathers as far as where democracy started, where we wanted it to go, how we essentially had to do mental contortions to embed slavery from the beginning in the constitution of our democracy. And I think there's so many artists dealing with this, like, what does democracy mean now? And I would love to see work on a project related to that. I would also love to see more dialogue between, say, for example, artists dealing with the refugee crisis as it's manifesting in Greece versus how it's manifesting at the US-Mexico border. I think there are some really important parallels to acknowledge, none of them pleasant. But again, sort of the question I began with is, what role does art play in these types of contexts, and what role does the artist have in responding to these types of contexts? Yeah, so. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm curious, you talked a little bit about the role of the museum in collaboration with other spaces. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like the role of education. You touched on funding a little bit, but one challenge for artist spaces is that funders and supporters often want to see these spaces educating the public or their impact. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on like educating the public as opposed to nourishing the artist community or the artists themselves.
Educating the public, like how do you educate the public about the good things the artist spaces are doing?
Sure, like
Yeah.
the importance of the process of art making and
Yeah.
just like what the museums as institutions have that role embedded in their missions, and artist spaces are often more focused on artists themselves.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, so often the role of education, and I don't think it's a bad role, but essentially it's very common with funding organizations to want measurable outcomes. They refer to this a lot, measurable outcomes in terms of, but how many people saw the show? And of course the NEA is infamous for wanting people, wanting some of it. I don't know that they do this anymore, but they certainly in the past have had a track record of literally asking their fundees to count the ethnicity of the different participants, like literally 10 black people were here, and maybe 5 Latinos. I mean, metrics like that, as a way of, in a way, trying to impose a capitalist model on artist funding that seeks measurable outcomes. So I think the reality of having to demonstrate measurable outcomes is there's not much to do about that. Like, it's always going to be there. I think a role that artist spaces can have, is, working collaboratively, not feeling like they always have to reinvent the wheel as far as what does an educational program look like, sharing resources and how that's propagated. And I do think there is a role for museums to play in educating people about artistic practice, which in the end is in the service of these art spaces. Like, in other words, educating people that, like, the artists are not just sitting around twiddling their thumbs while they're in their studio. This is, a creative endeavor. It takes support. It takes time. And actually just to go back to democracy, the most effective leveraging tool I've had as far as in terms of emphasizing the importance of the artistic process to the general public is actually leveraging the language of democracy, because you'd be very hard-pressed to find an American that says they don't believe in democracy. Like, it's a very American concept to be like, I believe in democracy and I believe in freedom. And essentially, I see my role as saying, well, if you believe in freedom and you believe in the sanctity of the free expression of thought, then you should support artists. They are literally the embodiment of free expression and free thought. And even John F. Kennedy identified them as a bulwark against the forces adverse to democracy. In other words, we need artists as dissident voices, as creative voices, to ensure a democratic society. And that does seem to cut through to a lot of people. Like, of course, everyone likes freedom, everyone likes democracy. So again, there's no one way to do it, but I have always been impressed with artist spaces that try to share resources between them. So, for example, the Front had a partnership for many years with Three Walls in Chicago. Sometimes the partnership can be across cities, and working with like the organizations like the Artists Alliance conference. So, yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but any other questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think museums are they're trying to find new models in this. Yeah. Yeah. Again, well, it's kind of this question of like, well, what turns the lights on in the absence of, say, if the NEA is not there, if the NEH is not there. I'm not saying public funding is the answer to everything, but in the absence of public funding, the vast majority of funding that supports museums today is private funding, and that comes with I love private. I love our supporters. I love our donors. But that comes with its own set of effects, right? So it's an open question as far as how do museums essentially balance the balance sheets? How do they keep going? And it's a question that's dealt with every day. And what are the effective structures? Especially knowing that museums are increasingly funded by fewer and fewer individuals providing larger donations. And that's documented. So it's interesting, yeah. But yeah, it was interesting. It was also fascinating to go to a country where we talk about fascism in the U.S., but it is in no way an abstraction in Greece. Like there's people full on self-identifying as fascists, and we do have them here in the U.S. too, but it not to the same. Yeah. So, other questions? I'm sorry to end on a dark note, but I'm actually a very optimistic person, and I actually want the tone of this talk to be optimistic. I think there's a lot of reason to have faith, and yeah.